Hello, everyone. Hi, everyone. I hate to interrupt your conversations. I promise there will be many more conversations after tonight as well. So we do want to get started in the interest of your time. So welcome to everyone, and thank you so much for coming out to participate and be a part of this conversation this evening. I want to begin with special thanks in advance to this wonderful team of people, Ryan, Tim, Cheryl, Jordan, Monty, and Joshua and Sandra, who have agreed to be part of this conversation this afternoon, or this evening, and to help us gain a better understanding about issues related to houselessness in our community, and hopefully about solutions that we can embrace and learn about. I want to welcome some special guests. I don't think Blake is here. Is Blake Darget? I didn't see him. I think he was expected. Didn't see him. Okay. Then I do want to especially introduce Rhiannon Hoyle. Rhiannon is here. Rhiannon is an ex-member of Senate. We know her so well. Rhiannon is the MLA for Edmonton South, and our good friend Janice Irwin, MLA from Highlands, Norwood. I'd also like to begin this evening in a good way by acknowledging that this conversation is being held on Treaty 6 at the homeland of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Given the fact that a significant number of people who are houseless are Indigenous, it is especially important that we truthfully recognize the history and legacy that contributed to the current situation far too many Indigenous people face today. And we must commit to working together in good relations with Indigenous people and their communities on our way forward to seek solutions that create a better future for all Indigenous people. I'd now like to welcome my good friend, Dr. Francis Whiskeyjack, to provide a prayer for us as we begin this evening. I offer this gift of tobacco in the hope that you will lead us in prayer so that we remember the sacredness of human life, the gifts of the Creator that provide us with shelter, and the need for all of us to work together to ensure that everyone has a safe place to live. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Peggy. Tansik akion wakumakanak. Kawiatukukisi kwamitsika sun nehionia nitskapu nehuche. So translated, my ceremonial name is Fine Day. I'm Treaty 6 residential school survivor, originally from Saddle Lake, Alberta. And I work here at the University of Alberta as a knowledge keeper, cultural advisor, elder, mostly just talking and motivating young people, especially Indigenous people, to be the best they can be in the interest of education and history. So ministers, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to be here tonight for this very serious topic. And I'm really pleased to see a lot of old friends, and I don't see it every day, but it's really great to be here. And so I ask you all right now, with the presentation Peggy just made with this, which is tobacco, as a protocol, a way of a sign of respect to have an elder or knowledge keeper do a service for you in a sacred way. And because there's tobacco in here, just as a teaching, this tobacco was used in our treaties, in the sacred pipes, as we made these treaties and promises because we're all treaty people. And so I just wanted to explain why I got this, and that is my contract to be here tonight. So right now I will ask you in a very simple way to remain seated, but to join me with your spirit. We all have a spirit that we need to acknowledge, and we call it the grandfather's, grandmother's spirit. You may know it as angels, that look after us, a guardian angel, but we have a lot of similarities. And your physical presence, the appreciation of life as you know it, the homes, we're so fortunate that we enjoy these luxuries. And so I give thanks for that every day, and that I'm still alive here. I never take life for granted. So honor that physical, it's very important. The mentality, especially in education, and the life choices that we make and how we choose our lifestyle, but also the sacred memories that we have in the good times, but also in the sad times. And those memories of the people that we love, those that have gone ahead of us in the spirit world. And certainly we see that a lot in our streets these days. And last but not least, to remember the times that you're happy and the good memories that you have, whether it's with family or loved ones, but also in our grieving times. I come from a traumatic history, and to know truth is to have a lived experience. If you don't not understand what somebody lives through that has gone through trauma, it's very hard to be aware and to have that understanding. So with that, please join me in this humble prayer. And I will use that prayer in my own language, which is Cree. Xmaga mamo tawi mau se mantugak se watsin nigan kinana skumten umagap minamoya pematsun ata pemina ep minamoya kamuapatama huaseaun utakap mai siniga tamtakuskea huta gawinanaski ata pues waskawitaya nipmatsunan so itamonan kiam gahki omma kam inamagusia sagitun atamskutatun. Help us to relate to each other in the way of love, the universal language, in kindness and forgiveness, but also in how we treat one another. That handshake that greets everyone when you say it in welcome, but also it may be the last time that you will see that person. So it's always good to leave and greet each other in a good way. Bless our homes from where we come from. Bless our children that are our survivors today, that are our future. Bless all of us as we enjoy the luxuries of life, and to look after the travels that we do in our commute to our purpose in life every day, and the gifts that you have given us as human beings. We all are all gifted in special ways, one way or another. And I acknowledge this Creator every day, that I never take life for granted. In a special way, as I stand here, I'm thinking of people that I visited recently in the hospitals, those that are afflicted with cancer, those that have diabetes, those that have AIDS, those that are from the street, that have amputated limbs, that are handicapped, those young children that do not know love in foster homes, those that need a place of belonging. And so, Creator, there are many prayers that I leave unsaid, but I ask those spirit guides that I know as the grandfathers and the grandmothers, to say those prayers for me, the things that I have forgotten, that I do not forget anyone. And if I have said anything out of line, I ask those grandfathers and grandmothers to forgive me. So for this today, and for everyone here today, and especially these panelists that are going to share in a special way, we give you thanks, Creator. Nanaskumun, ai hai.
You can always count on Francis to start us off in a really good way. This evening's forum is, for me, a culmination of many months of exploration and learning. It started in a conversation, Cheryl will know all about this, that I had with several previous recipients of honorary degrees in Edmonton, and we asked them what was the single most important issue facing our community, and they all said homelessness. And there was, at the time too, some questioning about the university's role and what kind of role the university was playing in an issue that is so important and has such devastating impacts on our community. Not only for people that are homeless, but our entire community as well. So thanks to many of the panelists here this evening that I got a chance to listen to and learn from. My goal actually for this evening is simply to shine a spotlight on an issue that is so vitally important in our community. As I have to say, in spite of good intentions and some positive steps, there is no doubt that the number of people who are houseless in Edmonton has grown. The complexity of issues feels overwhelming, and the solutions seem elusive. And we're not alone. Cities across the country and across North America are experiencing similar challenges to ours. We called this session Sheltering the Truth because there are misperceptions and stereotypes that get in the way of seeking solutions. And it's solutions that we desperately need. It's time to move beyond wringing hands and hoping things will get better. And that's my hope, that this conversation will start this evening. And now I'd like to welcome my good friend Tim Richter. Tim is the president and CEO of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Tim, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Over to you.
Thank you, Chancellor Garritty. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. And it is really lovely to be with this panel and to be here with all of you. I come here from Treaty 7 in Calgary, but don't hold that against me. So I lead the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and as the name suggests, our mission is to eliminate homelessness in Canada. But as you can imagine, this is becoming increasingly challenging. As you're seeing in Edmonton, and we're seeing across the country, we are under a wave of new homelessness. This crisis has been made exponentially more lethal by a global pandemic and a toxic drug supply. But to give you a sense of the scale of the disaster that we're dealing with today, homelessness in Canada today is bigger in terms of the loss of housing than Canada's biggest natural disasters, right? And it's one of the top 10 in terms of the loss of life. We estimate up to 300,000 people may experience homelessness in Canada this year alone. And to put that into perspective, that's 4 times more people who were evacuated in the 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire, and over 15 times more than the people that were evacuated last summer from Yellowknife. But homelessness on the scale we see it today hasn't always been here. And I'm old enough to remember a time before modern mass homelessness. And it began when governments stopped investing in rental housing construction in the early 1980s, and then eliminated affordable housing construction, eliminated affordable housing programs, in the mid-1990s. Which brings me to the first point I want to make tonight. Homelessness is a housing problem. Homelessness is a housing problem. It's caused by high rent and low vacancy. It is not caused by mental illness. It is not caused by addiction. It is not caused by poverty or poor choices or any other personal fault or failing. Homelessness is a structural problem. So to illustrate the point, I want you to think about a game of musical chairs, right? Imagine 10 kids around 10 chairs. One of the kids playing the game is a girl named Alice. So Alice sprained her ankle and she's on crutches. In the first round of the game, all the kids are in a chair. The music starts, the music stops. There's 10 kids in 10 chairs. But in the second round, a chair is taken away. The music starts, the kids scramble around. When the music stops, Alice is out. Right? Now, if you ask Alice, well, why did you lose? She's probably going to tell you she lost because she hurt her ankle and couldn't get into the chair fast enough. So it was her own fault. Right? But when you think about the game, chairlessness is the inevitable outcome of a lack of chairs. Right? Alice's sore ankle may have been a precipitating factor, or the precipitating factor, but she was bound to lose because there's not enough chairs, and with the sore ankle, she couldn't possibly compete with the other kids. Homelessness is the inevitable outcome of a lack of housing, specifically a lack of affordable rental housing. And with high rent and low vacancy, you can see how people with addictions or mental health concerns or low income or disability will be challenged to compete with everyone else. You can also see how racism and the impacts of residential school and colonialism factor in. This, of course, is further compounded by public systems like child intervention and corrections that literally project people into homelessness, literally and directly. You can see this playing out here in Edmonton. So between 2009 and 2019, Edmonton reduced all homelessness by 43%, right? That's the largest reduction in homelessness in any Canadian city ever since the beginning of modern mass homelessness. But between 2019 and today, you saw record population growth. You've seen the lowest vacancy rate in the decade. You've seen an increase in the average rent of over 17% or nearly 20%, and an increase in homelessness since 2019 of 43%. Right? Understanding homelessness as a housing problem is really, really, really critical, right? Because if you're recognizing homelessness as a housing problem, that means the solution must be centered on housing, right? Enforcement's not going to solve it. Shelter won't solve it. Forced treatment won't solve it. Only housing and support will. If you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to look up a book called Homelessness is a Housing Problem. Funny, I got that. How Structural Factors Explain U.S. Patterns. It's by a housing scholar from Washington State named Greg Colburn. So when they looked at the United States and they were trying to figure out why certain communities have higher rates of homelessness than others, right? They found that the only thing that explained the difference between communities and their rates of homelessness was the housing market. Right? Not the rates of addiction, right? West Virginia has the highest rates of addiction in the United States and one of the lowest rates of homelessness, right? Not weather. California doesn't have more homeless people than Boston, Los Angeles, you know what I mean, on a per capita basis. So it's not the weather. It's not politics. He compared Democrat-led cities with Republican-led cities, and it's not even poverty rates, right? And really, really importantly, it doesn't need to be this way. Homelessness and our housing crisis are solvable problems. But if we're serious about solving homelessness, we have to do a couple of really important things, and not exclusively. There's obviously a lot more to it. But two really important things. First, we need to build affordable rental housing. Secondly, we have to treat homelessness like the disaster it is and build local disaster response systems, local response systems modeled on disaster response. So on the first point, to restore affordability to Canada's rental housing market, CMHC estimates we need to create at least 2 million units of purpose-built rental housing, including at least 655,000 units of social and supportive housing. In the OECD, Canada has one of the lowest averages of social housing as a part of our overall housing mix. We're at about 3.5%. The UK, by comparison, is at 20%. Right? So to get up to the average of 6.5%, 7%, we need to add 655,000 units. But to give you a sense of how big a hurdle this is, Canada's only built 500,000 units of purpose-built rental in 30 years. This is a massive undertaking. It's a $1 trillion national project that's way too big for any one government or sector to take on alone. So the Canadian Alliance recently partnered with a group called RealPAC, which is the National Association for the Commercial Real Estate Industry, and we produced something called the National Housing Accord, which was a multi-sector approach to solving Canada's rental housing crisis. And in the Accord, we chart an achievable path out of the housing crisis. But frankly, we could have called it, Back to the Future, because our 10-point plan was based on many of the same strategies Canada's used in the past to solve earlier housing crises, like immediately after the Second World War and the 1960s. And it all starts with federal leadership. But we also need to treat homelessness like the disaster it is. So I'm from Calgary, like I said. In 2013, we had that flood that you may remember, and that forced 77,000 households out of their homes. In 2016, there was the Fort McMurray wildfire, and so a city of 75,000 people was evacuated, 75,000 households rather. So how many people do you think from Calgary's 2013 flood or Fort McMurray's wildfires made homeless by the fire or flood are still homeless? None. I'm betting none, right? Other than the people who were homeless when they evacuated the shelters, right? So why is that? Well, because in a disaster, there's a local disaster response system in place. A system that's focused on an urgent response to the crisis, keeping people safe, and most importantly, rebuilding and getting people back in their homes. Cities lead, senior governments support. There's a command center, there's a plan, there's an emergency response, there's data-driven decision-making, a means of coordination, and a focus on housing, right? When my parents were evacuated during the fires in Kelowna in 2003, they were taken to a reception center. At that reception center, they took their names. And they said, all right, Frank and Denise, where do you live? Tell me about your insurance. You know, how about your house? Talked about all their needs. Then put them in the Delta Hotel, right? When they were in the Delta Hotel, they kept them safe. And then after the fire passed or was resolved so they could get home, they said, your home is safe, but let's get you back there quickly. So we're going to send the utilities out to make sure it's safe and your gas is reconnected, that your house isn't damaged, and they got them back in quickly. The disaster response system is designed to respond to an emergency, but get people rapidly back into housing, right? But in most cities, when we're responding to the unnatural disaster of homelessness, we put all of our emphasis in the emergency response, like shelters, or, in Edmonton's case, sometimes sweeping people out of encampments, with little or no coordination or no focus on housing. We need data-driven, housing-focused, homeless disaster responses supported by senior governments in every city in the country. And that local system is exactly what Edmonton had in place and was using effectively to achieve nationwide, nation-leading reductions in homelessness. And Edmonton's success was led by Susan McGee and Homeward Trust, right? You may have heard about the Finnish model for ending homelessness or the Houston model, but what's worked is the Edmonton model. The model pioneered and fearlessly led by Homeward Trust. Through most of the years when Edmonton was reducing homelessness, you had an enthusiastic partner in the provincial government who supported a housing-focused response. But the federal government was AWOL, and housing wasn't built at the scale we needed. The feds have made some tentative steps back into housing leadership, but not at the scale needed to really solve the problem yet. I'm hopeful that's about to change. So I'm really fortunate. I get to work with a program called Built for Zero that we created, and we have the privilege of working with a growing movement of about 58 cities around the country, using the same strategies to end chronic and veteran homelessness pioneered so ably here in Edmonton by Homeward Trust. To date, 6 cities have ended homelessness for veterans, including Fort McMurray. 1 has ended chronic homelessness, also here in Alberta, Medicine Hat, and 4 are currently sustaining measurable and verified reductions in chronic homelessness. And this is all despite a crushing wave of new homelessness caused by the high cost of housing. So friends, homelessness is solvable. It is a solvable problem. We know what to do, we know how to do it, and Edmonton's already shown that it can be done. Homelessness is a choice. But it's not an individual choice. It's a policy choice. It's our choice to solve it or not. So do we choose to leave our brothers and sisters, our neighbors to suffer and die? Or do we choose to build more equitable and just Canada with housing for all? It's up to us, but I know what I choose. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. What a great way to start the conversation. And now, Ryan, I'm going to welcome you and all of the panelists up here, and we'll begin the conversation. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much, Chancellor Garritty, and it's a huge honor to be here. I think that our panelists can come on up and make yourselves comfortable and find a seat. I'm Ryan Jesperson. I host Real Talk Ryan Jesperson. It's an honor and a pleasure to be back as your panel moderator here at the Chancellor's Forum. I love the tradition of these, and like I was saying to the Chancellor backstage, so to speak, the conversation, the people that they bring together, so many familiar faces here, some new friends as well. I know that this room is full of movers and shakers and people who give a damn, and I can see it in your faces, and it means a lot to have you here participating in meaningful discussion, conversations that will happen here on this property today, that will happen via this live stream. Obviously, the seeds that will be planted in our minds and our hearts as well, and it's a real honor to be part of it. I love Tim's optimism that this is solvable, and I also love the perspective check, the word that you intentionally invoked several times, disaster, because that's the word that gets our attention. But you're not here to listen to me talk about this. You're here to listen to the experts. You've heard from Tim Richter, obviously. Next to him is Dr. Sandra Basirius, the Henry Marshall Torrey Chair and Professor of Sociology and Criminology, also founder and director of the Center for Criminological Research. She's doing incredible research in prisons. And we're not allowed to ask which facilities, we're not allowed to ask who she's talking to, we're not allowed to ask details, but at a high level, it's really interesting stuff, and I know we're going to benefit from your insights here. Everybody in here knows Cheryl Whiskey Jack, I think, and this is somebody who walks the walk and has a huge heart and also a ton of experience. Cheryl serves as the executive director with the Bent Arrow Traditional Healing Society, and we're grateful to have you here with us. Jordan Reininger is here next to me, the executive director of Boyle Street Community Services. What I think is unbelievable is that Jordan has agreed to spill the beans on everything that's happening with the Oilers Entertainment Group and the Boyle Street right now. You didn't know that when you signed up for the Chancellor's Forum, you were going to get the inside scoop on, in my mind, one of the most mind-boggling stories that's not where it needs to be at the top of the Edmonton headlines right now, but I'm not going to put you in that tough of a spot, at least not yet. We'll save that for his Real Talk interview. But Jordan will be able to talk to us tonight about what Boyle Street Community Services is doing, and obviously I'm not making light of the fact that they've got huge challenges in front of them right now, and they're on the front lines as well. Next to Jordan is my good friend, Dr. Joshua Evans, who's an associate professor of human geography here at the University of Alberta, also the lead for the Affordable Housing Solutions Lab. Looking forward to picking your brain and wrapping up, or rather anchoring, let me say. I like this. It's Dr. Monty Gosh at the end of the table, assistant clinical professor here at the University of Alberta, as well as the University of Calgary. Look at that guy bringing the province together. I like that. Monty's the co-chair as well of the Canadian Network for the Health and Housing of People Experiencing Homelessness. So thank you all for being here. Why don't we start with you? I think that the smartest way to kick off a roundtable or a panel like this is to simply ask what most jumped out at you, Doctor. What did you take away from what Tim had to say there just a couple of minutes ago?
Yeah, so the framing of it as a disaster is so crucial. And when you look at the mortality rates of individuals experiencing homelessness, it's staggering. And the life expectancy of someone experiencing homelessness, living on the streets, not having any shelter, and I want to kind of ask the audience this, what they think it might be. Any takers out there?
35.
You know what? That's close. That's exactly it. The life expectancy of a female experiencing homelessness is between the ages of 30 and 35. A male is between 40 and 45. The average life expectancy of a Canadian is what? 80? Well, it used to be 82. It's down to about 78 because of the opiate epidemic. But if that is the life expectancy of someone experiencing homelessness, why aren't we doing something about it? Why aren't we treating it like a disaster? And that's what we should be doing. We should be treating it like a disaster. We should be having a coordinated effort to deal with it. It is a complex endeavor for sure. It involves lots of stakeholders, from community social services, I should say, to health, to Indigenous services. It's very important for all of us to come together, but we're all siloed. We're not working together necessarily. Part of that is because of budget reasons. Part of that is because people have their own lanes that they have to stick to. But this lane kind of crosses multiple different sectors and multiple different fields, and we need to be working together on this. And it's very, very complicated. So I'm really glad that you talked about that, because we need a coordinated response between all of these different sectors, and we need to be working together to solve this problem.
Thanks, Dr. Gosh. Dr. Evans.
I really loved how Tim challenged us to think about homelessness as a housing problem. And I think that's so important just because of the stigma that houseless individuals face every day. And I think that really inhibits our efforts to truly address this problem. What I thought about listening to Tim, especially when he invited us to look back in time at some of the solutions that we've applied here in Canada, I couldn't help but think of Edmonton in the 1970s. If you look at the amount of housing, of social housing and subsidized housing that Edmonton created in the 1970s, it's outstanding. We went from a couple hundred units of affordable housing in the early 1970s to almost 9,000 units by 1980. But unfortunately, we kind of coasted on that supply going forward in time as the federal government withdrew from the social housing sector, and provincial funding ebbed and flowed over time. And here we are now with incredible shortages of subsidized and affordable housing in our community. And to complicate matters, we're actually losing naturally affordable rental housing in our community. So that housing is either becoming more expensive and out of reach of low-income households, it's being torn down and new housing is being created, and there's other ways we're losing it. But this is a critical problem that's heightening over the last few years and is contributing to the houselessness that we see today in our city.
Thanks, Joshua. Jordan.
Yeah, I like the way that Tim framed it as a choice, because we often hear about that some people are choosing this, or it's a choice somehow. And I think I always ask people to define what do you mean by choice, because if you think about somebody living in an encampment right now, what's the choice for them? It's an emergency shelter that they don't feel safe in. And we did a survey actually of the people that we serve who are living in encampments, and we asked them on a scale of 1 to 10, how safe do you feel going to an emergency shelter, mass congregate emergency shelter? And out of the 40 people who responded who were living in encampments, the average response was 1.7 out of 10. So that tells you something. So people are choosing encampments because it feels more safe, but we have to ask the question, encampment or emergency shelter where you don't feel safe, is that really a choice? And as we were talking about, Susan and I earlier today, the other choice that people are making is prison. And oftentimes prison feels like the best choice of the three. And so I think really understanding that it isn't a choice on the individual's perspective, it's a series of really bad options that they're trying to work through. But it is a choice for us as society about whether we want to live with homelessness or not. And you hear a lot in the sort of conversations these days about homelessness that is so complex, we don't know how the solutions, we don't know what the answers are, and it's not true. It's not complex, it might be a little bit complicated sometimes because you're dealing with real people, but complicated the way that a car engine is complicated. If you are a mechanic, you know what to do and how to fix it. If you're not, it might look like like for me, a big jumble of things that I have no idea what to do. And so that we do have the solutions, we've done it before, and this notion that nothing is working is absurd. Lots of things are working. What we are dealt with right now is just a flood of people who have come into the system and the system can't handle it. So this is the overflow of all of that. And Edmonton has been incredibly successful in the past. So.
Okay, lots to dig in there, and we'll obviously follow up on that. But first impressions, immediate impressions, Cheryl.
Of what I'm hearing so far?
Yeah, and in particular what you heard from Tim.
It is a choice, and it's a choice that we're not making. The thing that I feel very passionate about is that the work we do is way upstream from the folks that we're seeing in these encampments, that we're seeing that are houseless. They've been a part of systems that are a part of our social fabric. Child welfare is one of them. I have been at Benterra for 29 years this year, and so the kids that I worked with in the mid-90s are now in their 40s, and they're not housed. Many of them aren't housed. And so they graduated from a system unrooted, unconnected to culture, kin, community, all of those things. And they're out there trying to find a place to belong. And they were in a system when they were young, under the age of 18, that was paid to care. And as soon as they graduated from that system, this is what we're dealing with. And if you look in the encampments, the statistics of Indigenous people who are in there are high in Indigenous. So I always say we have big H historical trauma happening in there. Those are residential school survivors. And then you have small H historical trauma, which are the kids that I used to serve when they were teenagers in the 90s. Now they're in their 40s. So it's recent history and long time ago history. All of them are Indigenous people that have been not served well by the systems.
We've got a lot to talk about with the encampment, so more on that in just a second. Dr. Basirius.
Yeah, so being the last person is obviously not fair. Lots of good responses. But I also really appreciated the framing as disaster. And as Jordan already said, what we see, I'm a prison scholar, and what we see in the prisons is that many people choose prison tragically, and that has to be stressed, tragically, as a sort of temporary refuge, as a safer place to sleep than maybe on the streets, a place where they can maybe get 3 meals a day, and unfortunately also a place where they receive mental and especially dental care easier than on the outside. And I think Monty has already said we really need to work on connecting different systems together so that people, A, don't choose prison as a temporary refuge. That is a disaster too. But B, also, once they're released from prison, know where to go. And we're currently, even though I cannot really speak to the prisons where I'm conducting my research, I can say that we have very preliminary findings, and we're interviewing people on their day as they're leaving back into the community. And the great majority don't know where they're going to go that night.
Yeah.
And over 90% have received absolutely no release planning. So no one has ever talked to them about their transition back into the community. And that is a disaster. And Edmonton, I should say, is actually home to the largest prison in the country. So that is very unique about Edmonton and something we need to keep in mind. We're releasing more people into the community every single day than any other city in the country.
There's no way the average Edmontonian knows that.
No, but yeah.
Yeah. The insights on your research, and we'll get more into this in a bit, on sort of that, can I call it the prison experience? It's quite tragic, isn't it? Where you, well, let's just do it right now. You were telling us, what's the top priority for the average person that you talk to that's incarcerated? What's their top priority while they're behind bars, if I can invoke that?
Yeah.
And what's their top priority once they get out?
So the top priority as they're behind bars, well, as they're getting out, is to actually stay sober. So unfortunately, the majority of the population is trying to use prison as a place where they can get away from substance use that they're engaging on the outside, and they want to stay sober as they transition to the outside. But oftentimes that doesn't work the way that they envision that. And then also on the inside, obviously, a priority is to stay safe. They often tell us that prison is preferable over shelters, as Jordan has already said. Even though prisons are volatile spaces, they are seen as being less violent or maybe less problematic as some of the shelters in the eyes of our participants.
Obviously, people experiencing homelessness will experience it in different ways. We oftentimes hear about, you know, the people that are sort of like the couch surfing and staying with friends. They're you know, the people that are sort of in their cars. There are the people that are moving around place to place. In between finding affordable housing, there are people that have been on the street, so to speak, or experiencing homelessness for years. It's nothing new to hear of somebody sheltering in the river valley. An encampment is nothing new, but something has happened, hasn't it? This year, this winter, in particular in Edmonton, it's become the focus of the national news. It's prompted the average person that might not think about houselessness to be forced to grapple with it because they're having conversations with their friends in the stands at hockey games about what is the right thing to do with an encampment. They're seeing the police become involved in a high profile, and I'm sure if you talk to Chief McPhee, a rather undesirable situation because it hasn't exactly looked great for the police, including officers that I saw Janice Irwin tweet about it. One officer, I think, said to your face, I drew the short straw on this one, basically. I don't want to be here doing this. They don't want to be on the front page of the Edmonton Journal. They don't want to show up on Real Talk when we're talking about this, right? So how has the high-profile nature of what's happening with encampments everywhere, obviously, but we're talking about Edmonton, how has that changed the conversation? What is it doing to the average person's awareness of this issue, do you think? Cheryl.
Oh, that's me. You know, it's really polarized people, and I think, you know, nights like this, I think and I hope will shed light on the sort of real complexity of this issue. And one of the things that I've seen, because we're at many different tables as our organization because of who we serve, is people retreated into their own camps. You know, so the city retreated, the police retreated, the organizations like mobilized, and when we go, to Tim's point, like when we have a disaster, we come together, and it becomes like a multidimensional organizational response. And in this disaster, everybody like went into their own camps. And so, for us as an organization, there are all of these people that we work very closely with, and none of them are working together. And so we're at this table with the police, we're at this table with the city, we're at this table with our partner at Boyle Street, and none of them are, having meaningful ongoing conversations about things. They're making plans and they're executing them, and they're not doing it in consultation with one another. And we saw a very different response during the pandemic, where we all came together. That was a disaster, and we recognized it was a disaster even for homeless folks then. And that's when the Edmonton Convention Centre was opened up as a shelter, and many organizations and the city and the police were, like, everybody was involved in deploying that. But we just have had a very different response this time. And I think we're in an age of like truth and reconciliation, and so when you factor that in, it becomes asking very different questions, right? And having evenings like this or gatherings like this, I'm hoping create spaces where we can have those very difficult conversations and still walk away with some idea of like, what can we do next? But it is a multi-dimensional response that is very much needed. Yeah.
Same question to you. How do you think that the sort of like headline news, I don't say it disrespectfully, but the fact that it's in front of everybody and people can't ignore the story, is it advancing the conversation? Is it do you think that is this addressing this in a meaningful way becoming more of a priority? Do you see it from City Hall? Do you see it from the province? Budget's dropping at the end of this month. We don't know quite yet. The feds, the Prime Minister, you may have seen him exclusively on Real Talk yesterday. No big deal. But the federal Liberals come in and they drop a couple of billion in BC. They drop $185 million here in Edmonton. A big project down in Calgary. Like, what's happening? Put this into terms we can understand.
Yeah, I think as a starting point, one of the completely agreeing with Cheryl that it became a very polarized issue, a very political issue, and that was a great frustration to me because I think it was one of these unique issues that everybody actually agrees about what the outcome should be, right? Anybody who's serious, anybody who cares about people who might be living in encampments or the neighborhoods in which they are operating. Does not see encampments as a viable solution for people, a living solution. And so I think we can all agree encampments shouldn't exist. So then the question is, what's the path forward? And I think that's where that path forward conversation got very political and very polarized. And I think everybody is talking about it. You know, you as a media person, you know, like the story went on for a month, and it's still kind of going on and living on in people's conversations and what we're talking about. So I think, was it helpful? I guess it was helpful in the sense that it raised and elevated the issue. We have been talking for a long time at Boyle Street. Cheryl's been talking about it, about the number of people who are dying on our streets, the escalation of that. 301 people last year died on our streets. And the vast majority in Edmonton. And the vast majority of those people died outside in public places. So on park benches, behind dumpsters, not in hospitals, not in care, not in housing. And those are real people. Those are human beings. And so, you know, when I see the encampment issue, it's the friends that I see that I've lost that I'm worried about for their lives and for their safety. And so, so I feel like it became much more about winning a political fight than about the people who are in encampments. And that's a tragedy. It's a tragedy that we've done it the way that we have, because how you do these things matter. People who are in those encampments, despite a lot of the conversation around how much criminality is in there and those sorts of things, it's people trying to survive. I don't think there's a lot of organized crime kingpins living in a tent in January in Edmonton, right? And so I think it was a lost opportunity to do it in a really good and meaningful way. And so I hope that we'll continue to do that. I hope that the things that have been set up are successful and help people the best way possible. But there are other ways to do it that would have been more effective. We've done it in Edmonton in the past in a much better way. And I think we can learn from the successes we've had as a community and continue to do that. And I can talk about more of those sort of things that we've done in the past, specifically around encampments if you want down the road. But for me, it's a lot.
Well, you might as well just do it now.
Okay, I'll give you an example. So if everybody remembers back in, I can't remember what year it is because time is like this black hole now, but Camp Peckaway was a couple of years back. 2021. And so there was Camp Peckaway which was the big one, which ultimately led to the convention center response. So think about that. Millions and millions and millions of dollars to say we've got this number of people who are in encampments, we need to find a better alternative for them. So the convention center had its issues and its problems and is one of the reasons why I really learned and believed that mass congregate shelter as a system is just broken and can never work. But that's for another time. But on the south side of the river was Light Horse Park. There was 45 people in an encampment in Light Horse Park. So we worked with the city and the federal government. We rented an entire hotel for 6 months. We went to them and we said, listen, you can't stay in this encampment. This encampment is gonna be torn down. But we gave people 2 weeks, and it was in cooperation with the police. And we said, let us go in there and build relationships, connect with people, let people understand who's actually there and who's accessing that. Our teams did that. And at the end of that 2-week period, 100% of the residents of that encampment went to the hotel. Why did they go there? It was a private room. You could lock the door and feel safe and secure. And out of that 6-month transitional space, well over half of those individuals moved on into permanent housing. And the data is not even close in terms of outcomes from mass congregate shelter versus private room transitional housing. And so, so that's an example of how we could have done it better. I use the example, much to the chagrin of some people, about the $8.3 million that was invested. That's me. Yeah. The $8.3 million invested in putting more police officers on the ground. That same amount of money would have allowed us to create 6 months worth of transitional housing for 350 people. Now imagine the encampment response if you could take 350 of those folks and give them a dignified alternative. How different that would have made it feel like on the ground. And so that's what I'm talking about in terms of there are solutions. It's not like we're not spending money. Think of the resources that are going into this encampment response right now, the number of police officers, the cleanup, and the human whack-a-mole, right? Most people are not going to shelter. Most people are setting up encampments further out.
I feel like everybody knows what's happening.
Yeah.
Like just even the average person is looking at this going, like, what's the plan in the next hour from now?
Yes. Yeah.
It makes no sense, and I'm so glad that you used, I was about to invoke the same word, I'm so glad you talked about dignity and dignified response. So it's like, Tim, we're sitting here, and I'm an audience member here like everybody else, and everyone's going, this is solvable, we have the solutions, and we've seen it work, and we've seen it done before, and like, we're all sitting here going, so like, why don't we just do that? So what's the, like honestly, really dumb this down so we can understand it. Where's the breakdown? What needs to change? Like, is it more simple than we think? Are we overcomplicating this?
Well, again, it's the idea that homelessness is a choice and solving it is a choice. And the challenge with encampments isn't that we don't know how to solve them, right? The challenge is that, people see increasing homelessness. They start seeing drug use in their communities. They start to feel uncomfortable, and that creates political pressure. And then there are people who will exploit that fear, right? The encampment issue and the fear created by it and the discomfort created by it is being exploited. Is being exploited by people on one end of the political spectrum to appease a base, to win votes from a certain section of the electorate. On the other hand, on the other side of it, there is, say on the right-hand side, they're moving to a law enforcement place, right? And saying, well, there's this mass criminality, and I'm no criminologist or scholar, but I can tell you that you don't solve crime by arresting the victim, right? Now, on the other side, there are another group of activists and political actors who will have the exact opposite, where they say people have a right to stay in an encampment, right? The right to remain. And this dialogue has been lost. And so it becomes two groups shouting at each other, alternatively exploiting. You want to solve an encampment? As you said, talk to them, give them a better option. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not, like, we know how to solve it. This is a solvable problem. It's being caught into this really harmful binary that where certain political forces are exploiting it and others are reacting, and the solution gets lost in the noise of the conflict, right?
I wanted to jump in with Jordan talking about that camp south of the river and how many were successfully housed from that, and talk about how once people are housed, there needs to be continued supports for those folks to stay housed. Mm-hmm. We own and manage an apartment building in Inglewood. So if you can picture 124th Street north of 111th all the way to 118th, it's just all apartments, and we're one of them. And we have an on-site manager there who knows each and every tenant, knows the story, knows the struggle, knows the things that they're working on to make their lives better. And so when things happen, not if, but when things happen, we help them get the supports that they need in the community. Maybe they're with Bintero, maybe they're with Will, maybe they're with health, whoever, but we help them get those supports. When it gets dark on 124th, I tell our manager, it must feel like you're working in a nightclub, because all you see are whirling lights, because there's fire trucks responding to the apartment 2 doors down, there's police responding to the apartment across the street, because people are struggling. Right? So you have people who are in these apartments who are struggling, and one of the things I've talked to Savita about, one of the things I've talked to the City of Edmonton about, is if you get a manager who doesn't just take rents and fix your leaky faucet, you're going to be able to keep those tenants housed and housed well, right? And all along 124th, I won't say every building, but a lot of them are struggling, and you can tell by the emergency responses that come there all the time. And our building, if you look at the EPS heat map, it's just this little island of calm, because we have this manager in there who helps people when things are getting really hairy, really sticky, and we get them to those supportive resources. So I talked to the city about, like, maybe if we had some kind of, like, I don't know, special designation. If you're a landlord and you have the special designation, you have someone in that building who's going to do more than take the rents and fix the leaky faucets, support people to stay housed. That also would make a difference, right? right? So these are things that we talk about further on in the continuum. It's not just about getting them housed, but supporting them when they are.
And Edmonton's pioneered that support. 16,000 people have been housed since 2009 with that level of support.
We probably don't do a good enough job of telling the good news stories and the successful outcomes. You know, I sort of like polled a circle of people I know just casually in the weeks leading up to this event just to get a sense of where people's heads were at. If they were to, I know some of them are tuning in on the live stream if you are in the room tonight, and sort of said like, what would be your misconception or your preconceived notion, or what do you come into this thinking? And a lot of people said like, and I'm going to say it out loud even though it makes me feel terrible to say it, but like, most people don't care about this issue. They care if they're going to lose their housing. They care about if someone experiencing homelessness is perpetrating a crime on their property. They don't want it staring them in the face. But when you talk about the success stories and point to the fact that it is possible to solve it, people will start to care, because then people believe that this is something that people can band together. We have amazing questions submitted by audience members, and like dozens of them, and a lot of them are like, what can we do? What can we do to help? Like whether somebody's making, a single parent on the poverty line, or somebody that's making $700,000 annually or more, like what can we do? I mean, this is, obviously you guys talk about health outcomes and housing outcomes, but like, let's talk about the power of the public, the power of people, the power of public sentiment and political pressure. I mean, do we just not have enough of it? Do you think, Doctor?
I think, going to Jordan's point about treating people with dignity, that is something that we can all do. That is something that we can continue to do for this population if we aren't doing it already, right? It's such a crucial part of approaching the problem and understanding where these people come from. So I, again, have a sort of a health lens. We talk about tailored medicine, tailored care, your approach to the encampments and doing that engagement piece with the clients, learning about what their unique needs are, because the population is not ubiquitous. We tend to clump everyone who's experiencing homelessness as one solid group, and that's not true. They're individuals themselves. They all have unique needs. They all have unique wants. They have challenges that they have to face as well. And engaging with each of those individuals and understanding that is crucial. And it takes time to understand that they're not going to open up naturally, right? There's a lot of trauma there. And so one of the things that I talk about with my students, for example, is trauma-informed care. And having this lens of understanding that and I don't want to, again, clump everyone to this category of people who are experiencing homelessness have had trauma in the past, but there is a strong correlation between trauma that people have experienced in their youth and their outcomes later on in life, such as experiencing homelessness. That's also with substance use as well. There's other sort of correlations there too. But an everyday individual can treat people with dignity, can understand that there's a trauma background that exists with this population group, and be careful of that. And I think people can develop empathy if they understand that piece, that there is that trauma piece. I'll tell you this much. I work at the Calgary Drop-In Centre, and I would say about 50% of the clients that I deal with have been sexually traumatized in the past. And that's huge. That's a huge percentage. And you can understand why they'll escape from that by using substances, why they have some mental health issues, why they don't feel safe in shelters. And it's important to have that empathy. Not everyone can develop that empathy unless you understand that's where it comes from, because it comes from that trauma.
But this is a room full of people here participating in an exercise to deepen the empathy, to better understand the issue, to truly care about it. I know that what Dr. Gosh was saying was resonating with you. Let me tap you on the shoulder.
I only said 50% in prison. It is in the federally incarcerated population. We had 95% of all federally incarcerated men have experienced sexual or physical victimization in their childhoods before they came into contact with the criminal justice system. So not as a consequence or later on in life as part of their lifestyle, but as during their life course as children. And 97% of all federally incarcerated women. In the provincial system, it's a little bit lower. But yeah, we did a larger study on victim-offender overlap, and those numbers are astonishing. When you think about it, it's almost everyone.
we had such a strong Me Too movement,
Yeah.
right? And we cared so much about the violence that was perpetrated against women, and that's rightfully so.
Yeah.
But we tend to forget about this population,
Yes.
right? We don't treat them the same. They're forgotten.
No, if anything, to talk real, people joke about it. People think it's funny when you reference people going to prison, and it's something that it's like a world when that door closes. That no one on the outside can understand what it's like on the inside. No one on the inside potentially can understand the privilege of someone on the outside that's not experienced what they've experienced. I know what I'm saying is obvious, but it's worth saying. Josh, Joshua, pardon me. I want to just read a portion of your bio just to tee up the question, because I love what Cheryl's talking about. Your apartment building, by the way, just north of where we live, and so we get to see all those disco
There you
lights
go.
all the time too.
You know.
But your research focuses on spaces of care, home, and work, and the role in shaping the lived experience of socially marginalized and vulnerable individuals. Spaces of policy development, implementation in the role of the creation of healthy, enabling, and equitable urban environments. Let's talk about city planning. Let's talk about investments. Let's talk about infrastructure. It's the obvious next step. If this is only a housing problem, how do we need to better design our communities and better invest in them?
Well, I like to see housing as infrastructure. The same infrastructure that we depend on, whether it's electricity or power, any of those other utilities that make our cities run, housing is as important as that. Housing is as important as a pipeline, investment in a pipeline to Tidewater. It's as important as an arena.
Easy.
So I think when you begin to see housing in these infrastructural terms, and you acknowledge, as Tim has pointed out so importantly, that affordable housing is the biggest factor in addressing houselessness here in Canada, increasing the supply. What this calls for is significant government investment to scale up rapidly our supply of housing. And so what we can do as a city to enable that and accelerate that, Edmonton has already gone through a bylaw renewal process. So we've upzoned is one term that's often applied, making more types of housing possible in more areas of the city. This is not going to guarantee that we increase our stock of affordable housing. I want to make that clear. But it's going to create more supply. It's going to create more diverse types of housing. So knowing that, we need to layer on top of that additional solutions, additional measures to ensure that we can preserve affordability in our city. That can be things like in BC, they have the Rental Protection Fund, a fund set aside for nonprofits to get money to buy up existing affordable stock and transfer that into community housing. It can be things like rent control, right? Many people have a knee-jerk reaction to rent control. But what we're considering here in Alberta is rent stabilization policy, which is not a hard cap. It's allowing rents to increase over time, but it's keeping them within a particular percentage. And this could be incredibly important and powerful in preventing rent gouging, right? And we're beginning to see that in Edmonton as population has skyrocketed, as our vacancy rates tumble. This is a phenomenon that's only going to increase.
I know there's been some talk on the opposition side at the legislature about rent caps, rent controls, but can we acknowledge politically potentially very unpopular?
Very, yeah.
So the political will to actually legislate that probably actually very low. Maybe we should bring the microphone over here. But would you agree?
There's many provinces in Canada that have rent stabilization policies. It's not, these things exist and have existed for many decades. If you look in those provinces, there's housing being constructed and built, right? There's a lot of myths about rent stabilization policies, right? A lot of people say it's going to decrease the quality of our housing because landlords don't have enough money to maintain the stock. Well, we don't have rent control in Alberta, and landlords are letting their stock deteriorate and not addressing quality issues already, right? That's happening. The other issue that people point to is supply. And the evidence is kind of mixed on this question, but it's a strange argument to make that we can't have rent stabilization policies because it'll decrease supply. Because what that's saying is that landlords need to make these huge profits to stay in business, which that doesn't make total sense to me. So I think what rent stabilization policies do is it cuts right down the middle while protecting tenants. And it's a difficult sell in Alberta, for sure, but it's definitely a measure we have to consider. It shouldn't be off the table by any stretch of the imagination.
I'm sure that there's a few different people at the table that can comment on this. Tim, I'll lob it over to you, but the different levels of government will have their own say on who's responsible for this or who should take the lead on this. And then you talked to, I had Toronto's former chief planner Jennifer Keesmaat on a roundtable on the show a while ago. Now she's working as a developer, and I've talked to several developers that have basically said there is a will and there is a desire for developers and for-profit companies. It doesn't have to be a dirty word to help solve this problem. And the common theme I've heard from them is that governments just need to get out of the way. But of course, we don't acknowledge, or we must acknowledge the fact that governments also need to dump billions of dollars into this. So how do you find that balance? Where does government need to engage, put its money where its mouth is, and where does government need to let the market participate in this?
Yeah. Well, if you look at the rental housing market, in around 1980, up until about 1980, the federal government had a range of tax incentives for purpose-built rental construction. Those tax incentives stopped, and so did rental housing construction, right? And then in the 90s, so in about 1983, Canada produced about 25,000 units of affordable housing, right? We were building 25,000 units a year for a decade across the country, right? With the federal government involved, right? So we can build that level, but the gulf that we're in now is so huge. There's no government that's going to dump $1 trillion onto it, right? So we need to find a way to lever private investment, encourage some of that other construction, and have that focus the government direct investment on housing for those people who will never afford the market. Right? That deepest subsidy component. But I think ultimately, the federal government has a role in tax incentives and direct financing. Provinces play a really important role. The same thing in tax incentives and direct financing. And cities play a really important role in terms of zoning and those kinds of places that can add cost or reduce cost on the process. The problem is housing and homelessness are kind of like the political equivalent of a junior high school dance, right? Because they're all levels of government are standing around the edge of the hall, staring at their feet, waiting for somebody else to go first. Right? And so we need leadership from some level of government. Ultimately, it's going to require an industrial strategy. It's going to require collaboration and coordination between the levels of government.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we all say. That's what they all say. But,
Well, somebody's got to go
interesting to see what do you make of the federal government comes into Edmonton and the provincial government not invited. So you've got, the city of Edmonton and the feds making the announcement together. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities has called for that, for basically Ottawa to work directly with municipalities. Is that a step in the right direction, do you think? Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, again, somebody's got to start the dance, right? And I don't think the provincial government wasn't invited. I think there was meetings refused between different levels of government. And remember, Mayor Sohi asked for the three levels of government to get together, and they didn't.
Are you telling us that what politicians say sometimes isn't the truth, Tim?
Well, I don't want to say that directly.
Not all politicians.
No, but I mean, again, ultimately, so I've looked all over the world at places that are successful in reducing homelessness, right? And in every jurisdiction where there is success in reducing homelessness, where there is good housing policy, there is always leadership, right? The cities that have the most success in reducing homelessness have strong local leaders and have supported senior governments. This is what happens in a disaster, right? In a disaster response, the cities lead. And the province and the federal government come in their areas of jurisdiction, and there's a plan and there's an agreement between them. So if we can do that in a flood that kicks 77,000 people out of their homes, and the cities coordinate a really complicated, urgent, potentially lethal disaster response, right? Response to disaster. And the province comes in and says, okay, we do these things, we'll give you this, we'll contribute. The feds come in an agreed manner, we'll bring in the army, we'll do whatever. Like, we can do this for everything else. It ain't rocket science.
Before I move on, did anything that Tim said there resonate with anyone who wants to jump in, add a perspective? We haven't heard from you in a bit.
I would just say, like, to the point that I think one of the major issues is that nobody is ultimately accountable for the issue. And so everybody has the opportunity to decide what their lane is or what their lane isn't. And so even within the provincial government, there's so many different departments that play a role, different ministries, and no one ministry is actually responsible for saying, we're going to be responsible for ending homelessness, or we're going to take charge of this issue and make it happen. And so I think when you have nobody accountable, nobody responsible, everybody can pass the buck, and that's what happens. And you see this in our winter emergency response in Edmonton. Every single year, it's like December, and we're trying to figure out how we're going to fund our winter emergency response.
Yeah.
And it's not rocket science. Well, maybe not this year. Winter didn't really happen until January this year, but winter happens every year. But it's all these different levels of government playing chicken with each other, waiting and waiting and waiting, hoping that somebody else will fund it, and nobody actually takes responsibility for it. So.
Do you know, the one province in Canada that's achieved province-wide reductions in homelessness, that's Alberta. And that happened when the province decided it was going to take responsibility for ending homelessness. And they had a plan, right? The only province in the country that's achieved province-wide reductions in homelessness. Edmonton, largest reductions anywhere in the country. Medicine Hat, Fort McMurray, Calgary even, right? We all got reductions in homelessness when we decided that was what we were going to do.
Can we take a step back, Dr. Basiris, into your research? And I know that it's still sort of ongoing and happening, but the numbers are staggering. 300,000 people experiencing homelessness across the country, 300 plus deaths annually in Edmonton, which is a staggering number. We haven't even talked, I mean, I'm sure part of that, there's some overlap, I'm sure, with the opioid crisis, and we'll get to that again, and I think that demands our attention here today. But the numbers are staggering. I'm curious to know how your research is impacted by, we look at, Alberta bracing for what's expected to be a population doubling over the next 25 years, if you can wrap your mind around that, from 4.5 million to 10. And then you look nationwide, a number of factors, Canada's population expected to grow in great magnitude as well. A lot of people probably don't understand much about how our, I don't know what, do you prefer prison system, justice system, our legal system operates, but are we, how does Canada stack up? How does Alberta stack up on innovative research and evidence-applied principles? And, everyone looks at like Norway or like Sweden, these models of these countries that do these things, and apparently, like, mass murderers are like raising tulips and everything. Everyone's getting rehabilitated, but then, how are we doing?
We have a very different correctional system than Norway, let's say. The prison system in Canada is divided into two different sort of like systems. There's the federal system and the provincial system. So maybe let's talk about the provincial system. Provincial system is when people either await their trial, so they're in a remand center and are awaiting their sentence, or they are sentenced for up to 2 years. So that's sort of what the provincial system covers. There is, according to our participants, I will say, very little programming within these institutions. So unfortunately, if you are housed in a remand center, it is typically dead time. You are typically just awaiting your trial, or you are waiting to be bailed out of the remand center by someone putting up a bail payment for you, or you're awaiting your sentence. But there's very little programming for the people available, and so that obviously then leads to the bigger question, what the time in the remand center really did. Like, if we're thinking about prison as a space where people get rehabilitated, like in some of the Scandinavian examples. I, as a prison scholar, would say that is certainly not happening in our system. So, and the question also is, why do people, I mean, what's the connection here between homelessness or houselessness and the remand center, or why do people potentially choose to sleep in a prison versus in a shelter or on the street? I can give a quick example of a participant that I call Johnny. Johnny is not his real name. He breached his conditions because he had a toothache, and he really needed to have his tooth pulled. And so when he went to the remand center after breaching his conditions. When he was finally seeing the dentist at the remand center, his tooth was so infected that he first had to get onto antibiotics because they couldn't pull the tooth at the time. The infection would have spread through the body. So I asked him how he managed when I spoke to him on his release date, and he told me that he was on 12 T4s a day. So the maximum dosage is 9. He had been taking 12 T4s a day for 2.5 weeks. He was being released that evening because his bail was being paid, so he had to leave the remand center, and his dentist appointment to get the tooth pulled would have been the next morning. So I asked him what he's going to do, and he told me his only option is to breach his conditions again because he will not receive free dental care in the community. So we're often thinking about people in prison as people who have committed horrendous crimes, and some of them certainly have. But many people, especially in the provincial system, really have no other choice but to use the remand center as a social service provider. And that's a tragic state of reality.
And not to be the guy that just talks about the bottom line, but like if the general public was more aware of the cost to the taxpayer of like continually, seeing somebody in and out this revolving door in the administration of justice, so to speak, it becomes much easier to justify investing in more permanent solutions.
Yeah, so we did the math earlier. It's about $240 to $320 a day for a person at a remand center. So going back to the idea of hotels, that would certainly be much cheaper.
Yeah.
And more housing.
Well, I was going to say, I was going to talk to you about that as well, because in the hospital setting, for example, it's $1,000 a day for a bed. And we often keep people longer in hospital because we can't get them access to housing. $1,000 a day compared to the rent of 1 month.
Yes.
And so what are we doing here? And this population who's experiencing homelessness, we have data that shows that 30% of them interact with the healthcare system on a regular basis. They're high systems users. They come in and out of the emergency department, out of our inpatient settings, and at a huge cost to the healthcare system, where they could have reduced impacts on the healthcare system and have a better quality of life if they actually just got housing. And we put those resources towards housing.
Sorry, you get, Dr. Gosh, I want to, I always step on people's toes. Professionally, I do it, Dr. Gosh, I want to remind people that you're an internal medicine physician, a certified addiction specialist. You also work at a number of not-for-profit agencies, including shelters like the Calgary Drop-In Center, the Alex Community Health Center, as well as hospitals in both major cities. So you've seen a lot of this. I'm not going to drag Twitter trolls into this because they do provide limited value, but sometimes anecdotally it's there. I was talking about Alberta Views magazine. You can check out the most recent issue, and they talk about why detox doesn't work. So reads the front page of the magazine, which is it's a good hook, and it gets people talking. I'm not here to crack on detox. Obviously, there's a huge role for that, but I think, in my personal opinion, one of the great tragedies is that we're underfunding or pulling funding from supervised consumption sites and services, in particular in some prominent Alberta communities. Very quickly, my brother Kyle has worked for many years at Insight in Vancouver on East Hastings, and he's told me about the relationships that they build with community members. So back to the Twitter troll piece. Somebody engaged me last week and said, it's always these people, or the words we don't prefer to describe people who use drugs, about how they're not coming back, they don't utilize the services, sort of. And I'm seeing this person's attitude come through and realizing this person has no understanding of the community hub and the healthcare hub that these front-facing services provide. And if we're going to talk about, and I mean it's multifaceted solutions, people from many different scenarios, but can we talk for a moment about what you've seen when it comes to value, return on investment, real life strategy, evidence-informed approaches to harm reduction, and how you think that fits into this conversation on houselessness?
Yeah, so harm reduction is complicated, as you know, here in this province, but I think it's because of the framing of it in some respects. Now, harm reduction is very much a low threshold, what we call a low threshold intervention to care. And it's all about developing relationships. It's understanding that people might not be ready to stop using their substances, but it's an opportunity for the population to engage in improving their quality of life, however that means to them. It reduces the impacts of other healthcare issues that could happen as well, such as transmission of HIV, Hep C, and overdose death. But really at its core, it's a practical mechanism to develop relationships and get people into the care that they desire and they need. And that does include recovery in many respects. Yeah. And it is part of that recovery systems and oriented systems of care. So it's a crucial part of our healthcare system, and I don't think people recognize that necessarily as well, that harm reduction is a part of healthcare. It's also a crucial part of our social service system as well. And so, yeah, it's really engaging the population, developing those relationships, and getting them engaged with care ultimately. And that is complicated because people have experienced trauma. They've had trauma from physicians, from nurses, from the healthcare system in general. They don't want to engage with us necessarily. They don't trust us. And so by interacting with them on a regular basis where they come into supervised consumption site, they use their substances, they meet familiar faces, they develop bonds of trust, it eventually gets them into that recovery-oriented systems of care that we so much focus on here in this province. And so it is a part of our healthcare system. I think it's not necessarily recognized as such, and it is a necessary part of overall wellness for our society and for our communities.
Okay, we're gonna stick with you, and here's the assignment for the panel as we wrap. 1 or 2 sentences. That's it. 1 or 2 sentences, each of you, to leave with this audience, for us to walk with, for us to reflect on in over this evening, in the days and the weeks and the months to come. What's your charge to us, Dr. Gosh?
That's a hard one. We need to cooperate and coordinate with each other to solve this problem.
Dr. Evans.
I would just say housing is a human right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jordan.
I would say the number one thing that I think everybody in the general public can do is show kindness. And I think the people experiencing homelessness, particularly in this environment, are stigmatized, pushed away. Perpetually, they feel like trespassers in their own city. Perpetually, people are clutching their purses and walking across the street. They're seen as dangers and threats because of a lot of the rhetoric. And I think looking people in the eye, acknowledging their humanity is the best thing that everybody can do.
Beautifully said. Cheryl.
I think we are all 1, 2, 3 steps away from being some of these people that we've been talking about every night. I know every day, one of the ways I can relate is how hard it is to access a public bathroom. Mm-hmm. And I think we can all relate to that. You go somewhere, you have to buy something, you need a code, you need a key, and someone has to deem you worthy to use that facility. So imagine not having a home where you have a toilet that you can wait to get to, and how difficult that must be. And so to remember that we are all connected in this way, like we are all humans, to someone's point on the panel, I think it was you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're all humans and we all have these needs. And so let's quit putting dividers up and start acting like we're all in this together.
Amen. Dr. Basirius?
Well, as a prison scholar, I will say we need continuation of care, and I think that resonates. We need a non-siloed approach. People, organizations, and different levels of government need to work together. That's so that when people are actually being released back into the community, that they have continuation of care in the community and know where to turn to for simple things such as dental care. It should not be the fact that you're going to prison to receive such basic care.
Yeah. Tim.
I would say, as I've said, that homelessness is solvable, but it is a policy choice. And if we want to, we allow homelessness to continue because people are powerless, because they have no voice or power in the systems that could solve it. So if we want to solve it, then we need to share our power. We need to share our privilege, and we need to speak for people who don't have that voice, and call and demand our governments react appropriately.
Would you join me in thanking our panel today? As we hand the microphone back to Chancellor Garritty, just a quick plug, if you don't mind, Chancellor. Wanted to let you know that we're going to continue this conversation officially on the record tomorrow. It'll be 8:30 Mountain Time live or later on demand, wherever you get your podcasts or on YouTube. We're going to be welcoming Tim's going to join us. Chancellor Garritty is going to join us. Dr. Gosh is going to hang out with us. Jordan's going to join us in studio. And we'll continue this conversation. You can go to ryanjesperson.com to find how you can connect with that episode. Chancellor, over to you.
Thanks, Ryan, and thank you so much to this magnificent panel. It was, as I said at the beginning, I hope that we would learn something, that we would be engaged in the conversation that I think is so vital for all of us to have. I really do believe that we've fulfilled my hope for this evening. I have no ability to wrap up all of the things that my mind is just a swirl of things, but there were a few things that I absolutely won't forget. I think, Joshua, you were the first one that said this and I was shocked when you said this, that this is solvable. We know what the solutions are. I had been one of those people who thought it's just so big and complex. Where do we even begin? That message that this is solvable is something that we need to keep in mind. It takes the will of all of us. You know, when Jordan talked about kindness, when all of you talked about treating these people with dignity, I think that's another place that we need to start. And as Tim said, we need to speak up for the people who can't speak for themselves. So thank you so much for everyone for being here this evening.